Good evening, Fiji, and welcome to For the Record. Now, this evening, we're happy to be allowed into the home of our country's recently appointed, permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva. And a beautiful setting it is, quite a big change from the studio. And we thank Madam Nazat Shamim. Thank you again for allowing us into your home.
Thank you very much.
And, thank you for, you're just hours away from leaving our shores.
Yes, I am.
Now, first, I'll have to ask, how did you feel when you were first approached about the post as the permanent representative to the United Nations office in Geneva?
Well, for the past 5 years, I have been training legal practitioners and judicial officers and members of the media. So it was quite a jump to even consider how I would cope with such a responsibility and whether I would be a success. I mean, it's very important to ask yourself whether this particular job is for you and whether you can make a success of it. But then we had a family meeting and we discussed it. And I did a little bit of research and I spoke to other people in the diplomatic corps. And I then decided that, in fact, this was something that I would be very excited about. And now that I'm about to leave, I'm very anxious to get started.
Now, speaking of getting started, now this is Fiji's first office to the UN office in Geneva.
Yes.
Now, what do you think would be your first priority? Have you thought of what you'll be doing first?
I think setting up the office itself, making sure that we have a well-functioning team, that our team is the best that Fiji can provide in terms of trade and human rights, as well as the telecommunications union work, as well as the intellectual property. So we've got a huge array of services that we're expected to provide for Fiji, and my priority is to make sure that our team can supply those services and make sure that we're well functioning and that we're a happy team as well as hard working. So that's my first priority. I think the second, and very closely behind, is to establish networks in Switzerland with the United Nations agencies, with other diplomats, as well as with the Swiss government.
Now, how big a team do you have in the Geneva office?
At present, it is myself, it is I and the councillor, Mr. Elias Tuiloma, but I am told by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that I can go and make recommendations for the kind of team that I will be needing to respond to the demands of the office, and then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will then work with me to ensure that the team is a well-functioning one.
What are your expectations for this office, of this post?
I think it's going to be a lot of hard work. Hard work for me personally, adjusting to a new career, but also hard work for the team in Geneva, because this is the first time that we're establishing a presence there, and the first time we're going to have more direct relationships with specific UN agencies than we have before. So I think all of that's going to take a lot of time, a lot of patience, determination, a lot of research, and a lot of knowledge, and I think all of that is going to be demanding. So my first reaction is there's an awful lot of work, and I really want to just get on with it. The other aspect, of course, of living in Europe is very exciting. Of course, I studied in the United Kingdom for my university education, so I took every opportunity I could to travel in Europe, and I've always found the European experience to be unique, very exciting, a very cultured place to be, and in particular Switzerland, I think, will be a very exciting place to live.
Well, that's good to hear. Now, what about, I'll just ask very briefly, family and your networks here. How do you feel about having to leave?
I'm very sad about that, and I try not to think about it. And of course, right at the top of the list are all the workshops that I've run. I must have met hundreds of people in the course of my work, and imagine that was after being a judge when I wasn't allowed to meet anybody at all. And by saying not allowed, I'm saying that the whole judicial culture is that you have a very isolated life and you don't go out very much and you don't encourage a lot of relationships because you don't want to compromise yourself. So from that judicial background into the workshop environment was almost as though I was entering a party as a little girl and seeing that there were balloons in the world and all these different types of people. And I found that the best part of the job that I did. So leaving all these contacts, all the people I've met, and that sort of work behind is something, that, of course, that I'm sad about. And I feel that in the last 5 years I've grown myself as an individual in the career that I chose. But I'm confident that those networks and those people will continue to exist, and that I will continue to be in touch with them, and that they will continue to enrich my life.
The last 5 years, what would have been the most, the highlight for you? Do you think, is there a certain workshop or a specific issue that you had to touch on? And
My work with HIV workshops was probably the most rewarding, because I was dealing with training people from the president. I mean, it was so impressive that the president of Fiji came to the very first HIV law workshop. And together with the president, high court judges, magistrates, senior administrators, I was training doctors and nurses, and then, very important, people who were HIV positive. So throughout society, to work with that array of people in the HIV law workshops, and to empower people so that they understand what their rights are, and empower nurses and doctors to understand how they could adapt the medical profession with HIV rights, I think that was probably the most rewarding. But closely behind HIV workshops was probably the advocacy workshops that I ran for legal practitioners. When I was a judge, I remember on many occasions thinking to myself that it was such a shame that there was no continuing legal education for legal practitioners in Fiji, which focused on court skills. How to make a good submission, how to do a good closing address, not to read, how to think on your feet, how to turn a witness hostile, practical things like that. And there was never anything available for all the legal practitioners that they could register into. And so the second most rewarding sets of workshops were the ones I ran for legal practitioners, which worked on improving their skills as legal practitioners in court, their litigation skills. So I think that was a close second after the HIV workshops.
I'd say this would really help with the diplomacy skills that you're obviously feels like you're well tuned to this. Do you think?
I will have to learn to be more diplomatic, I suspect. But I think with training, when you are giving people feedback on training, it's very important that you don't make them feel as though they're never going to be any good. So you can never say, for instance, look, give up this profession. You're never going to be any good as a lawyer. Try something else. That is not available for you. And so you've got to ensure that in training you build up people's skills and their confidence, but at the same time prevent them from making the sorts of mistakes that judges will hate. So that balance of encouraging self-esteem and confidence with ensuring that you are giving objective and quite direct critiques, I think that'll be a good experience for me to build on when I start my diplomatic career.
On that note, we'll take a short break on For the Record. Welcome back to For the Record. We've been invited into the home of our very first representative to the United Nations office in Geneva, Madam Nazat Shamim, only hours away from leaving, and she's allowed us to come and take up more of her time. But we're happy to be sitting here and chatting with you. Now let's take a look at your career. It's been full of firsts. You've been the first female judge in the country, and also now the first the first permanent representative to the UN office in Geneva. Not only that, you've also come as the first Indo-Fijian to take this post. Now, how do you feel with all these labels and all these firsts? How do you feel? Does it make it even more daunting for you?
Well, my principle when I do anything in my career is to make sure that I do the best that I can. And that has always been the case. It's probably an attitude that I inherited from my parents, that whatever you do in life, you put your whole heart into it and you work hard. And when I do those things, I don't think to myself that this is something that I've got to do because I'm the first female judge or the first female DPP. I've done it because it's about work ethics and the way that I approach my work. But having said that, I think it's really important when people talk about my being the first anywhere, is to think for a minute about how hard it is. for a woman who is a first anywhere, because it is she who has to break all the barriers that are built from sexual stereotyping, all the barriers that are built as a result of hostile work environments in a workplace, all the barriers that exist because of the combination of race and religion and gender and all of the stereotypes that surround each of these components. So it hasn't been easy to be the first anywhere. When I look back at the time that I was the first woman prosecutor in the DPP's office, and I think about the experiences that I had to go through, I hope that no woman ever has to go through that again. And I remember thinking when I became the first female DPP that I'm going to create in this office the kind of environment where women and men can work equally and be rewarded equally for the work that they do. And I really hope that I did that when I was a female DPP, but it was my experiences as the first female DPP's officer that led me to make that decision and to ensure that that never happened to any other woman.
May I ask of some of the, how difficult was that experience?
Well, almost on the first day that I started in the DPP's office, and we're talking many, many years ago now, I was told that I was an experiment, that the office had had a meeting to decide whether it was ready for a woman. It's almost as though, we have to sit around and decide whether we're ready to have aliens working in the office. So that was the first thing. They made a decision as an office that we're now ready to take our first woman. And then, having made that particular decision, I was told, well, the future of all women in this office will depend on you. And that's not a very encouraging way to start off in any office. Then there were the posters, inappropriate posters on the walls of women who weren't very fully clad, draped over various motor vehicles. There were calendars. And in my opinion, the posters portrayed women in an exploitative role, and that in itself created a hostile work environment. Then there were inappropriate jokes around the grog bowl. The grog bowl would come out every day, and women were not particularly welcome around the grog bowl. But because none of the walls reached the ceilings, you could hear every word, and they were deliberately very warm jokes, I believe, told deliberately to undermine my confidence as a woman. All of these things combined to create, in my opinion, what is called a hostile work environment in human rights law when discussing sexual harassment. Having said that, after about 5 years, I was completely at home there. And we had more women. We had, I think, 2 more women by the time I had finished 5 years. And it was a completely different atmosphere. But it was that period of time when they were experimenting with taking a woman for the first time that was very difficult indeed. And constantly I wanted to say to people, please, just judge me on my work. I was told I couldn't do any sexual cases because I would become too emotional. Then when I went to court, counsel on the other side would say, well, we shouldn't have a woman prosecutor because she's going to be very biased because it's a sexual case. And for all those years where men prosecuted or were assessors or presided over sexual cases, no one ever raised the question of gender bias. It was when a woman started to appear that gender became an issue. All of these experiences, I believe, are experiences that many women in Fiji share. It's just that, I think that we should start talking about it.
Yes, I'm glad that you did too. Now, how do you feel that this has changed over the years? Where are we now?
I think the changes have come partly because gender has become part of everyone's agenda. So, everybody talks about the need to make workplaces more gender responsive, and that gender equality really means cutting past all the institutional and cultural barriers and just recognizing women for the work they do. So all of those issues, I think, have made a big difference. And so I think most workplaces now in Fiji are a lot more gender responsive than they were. But I don't think that we should be complacent about it. I think that there are still a lot of practices which continue to impact negatively on the ability of women to be recognized on merit and merit alone.
Now, obviously, there have been some highs and lows in your career. And being at the top of the profession, I know that you've just said that you don't see it as that way. As with all the labels, one of these labels have been leader. How do you feel about being thought of as a leader?
I think when people write to me and say, look, you're my mentor, or I've always looked up to you, I think that you immediately become aware of a very heavy sense of responsibility, that you can't let people down when they look up to you in that way. But also I think immediately of my parents. Many years ago, my father gave me a book called The Secrets of the Self. And it was a book that was written by a very well-known poet, Muhammad Iqbal. And on the front cover of the book, he wrote, "To my children, whom I want to be leaders of the world." And I think my parents always hoped that their daughters would become leaders in whichever field that they decided to choose. But I've never seen myself as one because I consider myself to be a person who has a long way to go still in deserving such a role. But when people call me a leader, I'm very aware of that heavy sense of responsibility.
When you speak of your father, how much or how did you get into the legal profession, and did your father have a lot to do with your choice of profession?
He didn't have a role in choosing my profession because his position was that we should all choose whichever profession we were suited for academically and in terms of our character. But and the person who actually helped me to choose law as a profession was my English teacher in Form 5, Mr. Cliff Benson, who said to me that I talked so much in school, in class, and was so comfortable on my feet in school debates and speeches that I should consider the law as a profession. I'm not sure whether he was serious about it, but I took it very seriously. But then, having made that decision that I would study the law, my father and my mother were extremely supportive. It was an expensive field to fund, especially as I wanted to go to the United Kingdom. And it was also demanding because I didn't come home for 5 years. So they knew that, and they put immense trust on me that they would see their daughter off for 5 years, and they would fund everything that I did with this belief that I would come back as a qualified lawyer.
Well, we'll continue chatting right after this short break. Welcome back to For the Record. We're joined by our first representative to the UN office in Geneva, and she's welcomed us into her home. We're talking about, well, Madam Shamim, your career. And you've spoken out against our prison conditions, and the reprimand of prisoners in Fiji, in fact, led to changes in our legal system. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
The entire situation, of course, arose because of bail applications, which were made in the High Court when I was a High Court judge in the Criminal Division. And it was very apparent, and everything that I'm now about to say is in fact written in judgment, so it's all a matter of public knowledge. It became very apparent to the criminal judges that the complaints which were coming out of prison from prisoners were very, very uniform, very similar. So that led us to make a scene visit to the Corovo prison. And of course, when we visited with the Human Rights Commission, the Legal Aid Commission, and the DPP's office, we found that the conditions were in fact considerably worse than the prisoners had told us. And it was a reason really to measure our prison conditions with objective international standards. Now, it's often a misconception that when you're looking at human rights, that ultimately it's an emotional reaction. It's not. Fortunately, the international community has set out objective criteria for measuring the suitability of prison conditions. And in this case, it was the minimum standard rules for the treatment of prisoners. So the judiciary, the judges, the 3 criminal judges were able to measure the prison conditions against the international standards, which in fact even specify things like cell sizes, how much fresh air you should get, how many hours you should be given to exercise, the kind of food you get. It's very specific. And it really allows you to make that decision, taking out all emotional response and just concentrating on the objective criteria. So we did that, and we said that the prison conditions were inhumane and degrading according to international standards. After which now, of course, now I've heard, I think it was just last year, that there is a new remand center at the Corovo prison, that it satisfies international conditions, and that it is a place where, you know, sending people to remand while they are waiting for the trial is no longer a matter of conscience for judges. I don't think judges want to send people, you know, in the course of a criminal trial to a prison facility where they know that they're going to be treated inhumanely. It is a blot on the judicial conscience. So judicial concern for prison conditions is completely in line with the whole ethical duty of a judge. So we were very, very concerned with the prison conditions. And of course, the result of our rulings that the prison conditions at Corovo Prison in the remand center were inhumane and degrading, the result of that was that everybody who applied for bail and who was kept in that facility was granted bail, even though they were a flight risk, even though, you know, they may never come to court, which under the Bail Act is really the overriding consideration. So we were balancing our domestic law and our Bail Act with the constitutional right to be kept in facilities that are not inhumane and degrading. And exactly the same right, of course, is in the 2013 Constitution. In addition to that particular right in the 2013 Constitution is the right to be free from violence and degrading conditions at home and at school and anywhere else. So really the protection of prisoners, I think, has strengthened under the most recent Constitution. And I think that this is something that in Fiji we should be very pleased about, because certainly it was a matter of judicial concern that the prison conditions were inhumane and degrading.
Now, I'm sure judgments like this, as you have stated, you go exactly by the law, but it would have taken some time because public response when it wasn't so popular. People felt that prisoners deserved what they needed to go to jail. That's obviously what many would think.
Look, when you look at the whole area of human rights law, the people who are challenging the way that things are done in the domestic sphere are usually people who are not popular. They're not the sort of people you're going to bump into in a cocktail party or who you think, you know, are a pin-up girl or boy. These are people who are prisoners, people who live in squatter settlements, people who are completely disempowered. They're the ones who are going to make this challenge. And when they make the challenge, the decision is often unpopular with the public, who probably think that the courts are going too far. Now, the reason why there's a lot of skepticism about the role of the development of human rights law is because judges are not elected. And in the majority of countries, judges are by nature quite conservative. So they're not the sorts of persons who are necessarily going to be, you know, picketing in the streets and carrying banners and so on. They're conservative people. But the fact that the judiciaries around the world have really embraced the development of human rights, I think is a very positive thing. And of course, one of the reasons why the judiciary must be relied on to develop it is precisely because they don't have to pander to public opinion. It's because they are not elected that they are free to make unpopular decisions, as long as those unpopular decisions are in accordance with our obligations under human rights law. So unpopular, we were extremely unpopular after the prison's decision. People said, well, you know, you don't go to prison to get treated as though you're living at the Sheraton. Correct, you don't get sent to prison to be treated as though you're in the Sheraton, but the punishment for a person who goes to prison is the fact that his freedom or her freedom is now restricted, curtailed, and removed. That's the punishment. You don't get sent to be inflicted more, you know, degrading treatment. The punishment is the fact that you are in prison and you can't come out. So I think the lack of popularity about a decision like that came from a misunderstanding about the purpose of the prison system.
Well, we're fast running out of time, Madam Shamim, but I'm going to ask you, what are your hopes? What do you hope for Fiji, our legal system perhaps, and also for the role of women in leadership in Fiji?
I hope for equality. I hope that for women, that they will be treated in accordance with the excellence of their thoughts and their conduct. I hope that in Fiji we will create an environment for men and women from all ethnicities and cultures and religions where they are free to think according to their conscience and to act according to their conscience, and where we are judged according to the excellence of our conduct. That's what I hope for.
And for Geneva, what are you going to miss most about, well, home?
I'll miss the people. I think, the whole concept of walking through our streets and going to functions where you know half the people already, and where strangers will come up to you and kiss you and say, "You remember me?" And of course, usually you don't, because the last time you saw them was when you were 3 years old. But then they'll tell you what their relationship is with you through your parents or your sisters or some other, or through work. I find that one of the most endearing parts of Fiji. And one experience which I will never forget is going to the super prison and finding that a prisoner whom I had sent to prison had painted a portrait of me with great affection. And to me, this is the Fiji which I will miss.
Bonne chance and bonne journée.
Merci beaucoup.
And we call it a wrap here on For the Record this evening. Thank you again for joining us. For comments and questions, you can send them to fortherecord@fbc.com.fj. We'll talk to you again next week. Good night, Fiji.